Hello readers, welcome to Planet Fantasy, where we talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and speculative fiction. Bonus episodes will feature shows and movies and anything else that I want to talk about. I am your host Moses, and before we get started, if you're watching me on YouTube, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. And if you're tuning into the podcast, subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any new releases. Now, on to the show. Hello, followers of the ancient gods. Today I am talking about the 2016 novel Lovecraft Country. Written by American author Matt Ruff, this novel bends genres for a strange ride through the racially segregated 1950s, and it features ghosts, racist wizards, and space travel through the uncharted universe. I'm going to give you some background on Matt Ruff and his novel. I'll provide a brief synopsis of the plot with spoilers, and then talk about the lore of his universe. The first time I heard of this story was actually through the marketing of the HBO series based on the book, and that aired in 2020. I didn't even know that there was a book called Lovecraft Country. I just noticed the marketing one day when I was scrolling through the streaming options on HBO, and I saw the image was a couple, a man and a woman, and they were surrounded by tentacles. And so I thought, oh, okay, this is something to do with H.P. Lovecraft's work, and I'll get into this in a minute, but I just didn't know anything about it. So I saw the ad one day, and I just decided to look it up and see if this was something I would be interested in, and it turns out there's a book, and the book had good reviews, so I thought, why not? Got it from the library and checked it out. So the author is Matt Ruff. He was born in Queens, New York in 1965, and he claims that he decided at the age of 5 years old that he wanted to be a fiction writer, and that he was always writing as a child. From what I can find on the internet, he became a student at Cornell, and he became a published author right outside of college, and that was with his senior thesis. The way he describes it is that he got most, if not a lot of his amateur writing out of the way while he was writing through his adolescence. And the way he describes it is that his first truly successful novel, it was called Bad Monkeys, but that it was Lovecraft Country that made him an overnight success. So, looking at his website, he has 8 published books, the most recent of which is actually a sequel of Lovecraft Country, and it's called The Destroyer of Worlds. I didn't know that this was published until I researched for this episode, and it was a pleasant surprise because I enjoy the universe of this book, and I'm happy to check this out soon. I want to see the sequel. But if you look at the description of his other published works, they seem to all fall into the more speculative fiction genre, but with varying themes. So in fantasy, it seems more often than not that an author sticks to that genre. So Matt Ruff's foray into what I call fantasy with this book is interesting to me. So the book itself, you can tell with the title of the book and the book cover that Matt's story is going to attempt to evoke themes drawn from the works of deceased author H.P. Lovecraft. Mr. Lovecraft is a long-dead author who is known for his very strange brand of fiction meets horror meets fantasy. And the theme is generally centered on long-dead ancient and colossal monsters, or these ancient gods buried deep within the earth or in the ocean, or maybe even the outer reaches of space. And they are slumbering under the ocean and will maybe someday awaken and either enslave or destroy the human race. I'll cover more about H.P. Lovecraft's life and his particular work later when I look at his book. But his stories aim to create a sense of dread in the reader, and the fact that they're still around in the public consciousness is a testament to their ingenuity. The most famous of his works is called The Call of Cthulhu. Cthulhu has become an internet meme and has been famous on the internet for a while, and his name has actually become a descriptor. If someone calls a story or the idea of a story Lovecraftian, They mean to evoke several images, including these giant horrible creatures. Sometimes they're called eldritch creatures. There's the image of octopus tentacles, which I mentioned earlier, because those are characteristic of his monster Cthulhu. And the other image is that of a secret cult that worships these old ancient gods, because in his lore, there have always been secret societies that know about the eldritch gods and still worship them today. And even on the book cover, you'll notice the octopus tentacle theme. And so the term Lovecraft Country was actually not originated by Matt. Itself was coined in the 1980s by a man named Keith Herber, who created a role-playing game called The Call of Cthulhu, and it refers to a fictional area in New England where several of Lovecraft's stories take place. Kind of like the way that Stephen King's stories generally take place in Maine. There are certain parts there. Castle Rock, I think, is the setting of a lot of his stories. Well, that part of the country for H.P. Lovecraft in that New England area is now kind of considered Lovecraft Country. But the point I want you to know is that Matt is building on a pre-existing world, a world built by Lovecraft, and maybe even Keith Herber's role-playing game. And yet he is putting it in the context of Jim Crow America, which is a totally original creation as far as I know. Another reason that I was intrigued by the book is because I was born and raised in the American South. You may be able to tell by my accent. So I have personal experience with the complex racial dynamics of America. And although I was not born yet in the segregated South, memories do not die here. So I grew up hearing about the attitudes and feelings that pervaded the country just several decades prior and after Jim Crow laws were abolished. And so in a special way, this is a type of fantasy that I felt was extra immersive for me. In the same way that I imagine Harry Potter is extra immersive for British readers. People who are local to the regions of stories are going to have a better understanding of the context of that story. And so I would never have connected Jim Crow America to any sort of science fiction or fantasy literature, so I was genuinely curious about what this story would look like. So first, I'm going to summarize the plot, and then we'll get into the details and lore and kind of my review on the story. So the book itself is divided into 8 individual stories with overlapping characters. So it's sort of an anthology series, but there are several connecting plots that I want to focus on in particular. Since there are 8 individual stories, I'll talk about the plot with spoilers for my favorite ones before moving on to the next one. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll talk about the more significant ones. The first story is called Lovecraft Country, and it follows a young black man named Atticus Turner as the main protagonist. And by the way, all of the protagonists in this book are black. Atticus was recently discharged from the army, and the story begins with us following him as he journeys home to Chicago to find his father. He and his father, Montrose, are estranged, and so this letter is unexpected. And in it, Montrose states that he's journeyed from Chicago to a place called Ardham, Massachusetts, in order to find out details about the mysterious family of his late wife and Atticus's mother. The location is known to be a very dangerous part of the country for people of color, yet he sets out to find him, and he's accompanied by his Uncle George and his childhood friend, Letitia. And so this is where the book again intersects that kind of Jim Crow American culture, because travel is part of their family culture, because the family owns and operates a business that publishes a book that helps black travelers find black-friendly havens around the country, like restaurants and hotels and tourist attractions. And so if you remember the movie Green Book, this concept is based on a real-world publication back in the day called the Negro Motorist Green Book, also known as just the Green Book, which functioned in the same way in real-life America. It was published by a black American postal worker. His name was Mr. Victor Hugo Green, which is why it's called the Green Book, and I can see why that would have been necessary, of course. Even if laws were eventually changed to allow greater freedoms, so many areas were still very dangerous for black people, and arguably still are, especially after sundown. And oftentimes, my black friends have educated me and told me that local law enforcement was just as much a part of the problem. And so it only made sense that this sort of printed underground social media would be dispersed among black travelers to help them enjoy life the same way everyone else was able to enjoy life. And so this creates a great historically grounded background for these characters as they journey from Chicago into Massachusetts. And then they have a serious run-in with the police when they do finally arrive in Ardham. In one of the more tense scenes of the book, several deputies find them near the woods and walk them away from the road with intentions to murder them in the countryside. Personally, some of my best friends are black, and they have communicated to me that they make sure that they are not in rural areas, especially after dark. And it wasn't until they explicitly told me this that I ever really spent much time thinking about how scary the country can be for minorities. Not only how scary it was, but how it still currently is in many ways. And so these kinds of scenes in this book keep the tension built around both the supernatural elements as well as the white human characters as well. So fantasy and sci-fi often deal with questions of racism between fictional races and species, but this kind of context grounds these themes in the real world. Fortunately, Atticus and George are able to escape because Letitia, who is my favorite character in the book, she stowed away in the car and she very cleverly detonates the police car as a distraction. So the bad cops are also suddenly hunted and killed by some strange creature that emerges from the woods in the first scene that features explicitly supernatural elements. But that really cranks up when they finally arrive at this huge manor in the woods, where they are told that they were actually expected. So the manor is the property of the Braithwaite family, who turn out to be a very powerful family of, again, spoiler alert, wizards, also called the Order of the Ancient Dawn. So these wizards form a secret society, and they have this conclave at the manor to perform a ritual to unlock this powerful ancient magic that they are going to use for their own purposes. So it's here that we meet our first main white character named Caleb Braithwaite, who is himself also a wizard, and he appears several times throughout the anthology stories of the book, and anytime he appears, he is very much a plot mover. So the twist of this first story is that Atticus is actually in the Braithwaite bloodline because his mother was impregnated when she was a household servant and she fled before he was born. Again, that is also tied up in some accounts that we hear of real-world American history where slave women were impregnated by their white slave masters. So our trio discovers Atticus's father. They finally find him hidden on the premises, and Atticus helps Caleb Braithwaite sabotage the ritual. So even though Caleb is part of the wizard enclave, he has his own self-interest at heart, and so he sabotages the ritual and kills all the members of the conclave. So after the plan is disrupted, Caleb lets the trio go, and they return to their home in Chicago with Montrose in tow. So the first lore item that stands out to me in this first story is that magic exists in this universe and that it is controlled by wealthy white men. The wizards in the conclave are portrayed as the old money style businessmen. So think of the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts. They are portrayed as like this elite group that controls the secrets of the universe in the same way that they would perhaps control real world institutions like the banks or government institutions or businesses. So this actually realistic storytelling, I think it's realistic because if America were to be the center of a high fantasy story, it would be fair to portray the wizards, I think, as belonging to the top 1% of society, which in the case of historic America, they were a small group of Euro-American elites. And so I'm not saying that I believe that the elite white Americans are evil. I'm just saying that if you are playing around with the idea of wizards and powerful, power-hungry magicians from that era, it would make sense. And it's also not lost on me that the Ku Klux Klan used fantasy terms in their organization, like Grand Wizards and Grand Dragons. They wore these white robes with these white hoods. And so I think it's pretty creative to imagine the robes and the hoods of the KKK to be analogous to a secret magical society. So that is story number 1. Another story that I want to talk through is called Hippolyta Disturbs the Universe. So this story was interesting to me because it focuses on a new character, Hippolyta, and she is Atticus's aunt. She's the wife of George. And so this story is her solo adventure. So this is the 4th story in the book, and it follows a story in which Letitia buys a haunted house in an all-white neighborhood that is haunted by the ghost of a man named Hiram Winthrop. So we find out later that the wizard Caleb Braithwaite, as I mentioned, the main white character who works his way through the stories, he orchestrated the purchase from the shadows to continue his grand scheme involving Atticus's family. But the reason I mention that story, even though I'm not going through it in detail, is because one of the rooms in the haunted house, the haunted Winthrop house, it contains an astronomical clockwork device. And that provides Hippolyta these coordinates and a key to this isolated observatory in Wisconsin. So again, the family in these stories is often traveling because they're doing research for the field guide. And so she goes to this observatory under the pretense of doing research for the guide, and she goes by herself. She winds up in this isolated countryside, as I mentioned earlier, of that time period that was probably not considered a safe idea. And just like the trio in the first story, she has to worry not only about the strange magicians and the weird science fiction elements, but also about the local authorities. She locates the building and she calibrates a structure that opens a gate to this seemingly random location in a random part of the universe. But for some reason, the location was calibrated within the Winthrop house. And so there is something about this spot. So she goes through this portal into this other world, an uncharted universe. And there she meets a woman named Ida, who also was a black woman, and she is marooned in this corner of the universe. And originally she had been marooned there with several of her coworkers by Mr. Winthrop as a mean to coerce them, to threaten them. He wanted to get some information about the location of his son because his son and another of his black maids had run off. So he puts her and several of the other helpers onto this planet to punish them. And so the plan was to leave them there for a while until they cracked, but unfortunately he was actually murdered by Mr. Braithwaite before he even returned. So Ida tells Hippolyta that she's the only one left. And so it has this very, I guess, It has a Ray Bradbury feel to it. If you've read any of Ray Bradbury's short stories, this chapter feels very much like a chapter in one of his books. So she gives Hippolyta a box and tells her that she has a gift for her and asks her to open it only when she returns home. Ida has made it clear that she has no intention of coming back through the portal with her, and she wants to stay where she is. She kind of comes across as this maybe unwell or paranoid woman, which, I mean, how could you not be if you've been living on a planet by yourself for many years? So Hippolyta, I'm not sure the exact way to say it. I'll say Hippolyta. She returns to Earth, and of course, which is immediately confronted by several white security guards, which threaten her with bodily harm. And like the first story, she comes close to being murdered by them. So in a panic, she opens the box given to her by Ida, and it actually contains this really aggressive alien creature, and it kills both of the men. So Hippolyta realized that Ida did not want her to live. She gave her that creature in the hopes that it would kill her, and thus she would remain secret in the universe for forever. So the main lore item from this story that I find most interesting is that we learn that the wizards on Earth have devised ways to access other planets and star systems. This is where I felt the book moved solidly from fantasy or fantasy horror into science fiction territory. Before this story, we knew that magic and ghosts existed, but in this story, it moves it firmly into the Twilight Zone type sphere of storytelling, which I quite like. Matt Ruff connects these characters to the old school science fiction pulp books of the last century with the comic book characters, and I like that he moves in that direction. And lore-wise, it makes sense that magic would have extraterrestrial ramifications. So now we solidly have both magic and science fiction in the Jim Crow American setting. And as a sidebar, I've heard that readers of color have articulated the difficulty of breaking into the speculative fiction spaces in fantasy or sci-fi because they are so overwhelmingly Eurocentric. So what I mean by that is arguably the fantasy genre as a standalone type of literature was created by J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. And since he created the genre of high fantasy, the standard for traditional fantasy books has been very European. Usually the setting is in the shadow of a European type country. The governmental system is usually medieval. You have your classic characters of the wizard and the archer and the sword bearer, and you have various types of stand-ins or species for different races. But it's an overwhelmingly white or European genre. And so I thought it was nice, and I think it's cool to have some black female characters doing their thing and going on space adventures. It's also another scene with a strange alien creature, although I do not think that any of the creatures featured in the book are particularly Lovecraftian in the traditional sense. When I think of Lovecraft monsters, I'm expecting creatures that are the size of buildings or characters that are walking around on an island and the island turns out to be the back of this giant ancient god or something huge like that. But that's not the direction he went in this book, and I'm okay with that. Although it does stand to reason that within the lore of the universe, that since these wizards are able to access the deepest recesses of space and they have that ability, I think it's safe to assume that the lore in this universe sets it up to where these creatures are able to be accessed by magic users or space travelers. And if they haven't, that they will eventually run into the more Cthulhu-type creatures at some point. And so I would actually love to see that in the sequel. I'd love to see larger monsters. I'd love to see them featured more prominently in the stories and see how the wizards play into that element. And there's also another piece of lore that comes from this story, and it's that magic in this universe is difficult to access. It's tied to bloodlines and these long, drawn-out rituals and lifetimes of study, at least in executing it from one's own skill. Now, our non-magical characters in this book can still use magical items. At one point, Letitia has a wand that she's using and even affect the magic rituals. But in Lovecraft Country, the average humans will not be doing any sort of magic. It's not merely incantational, but it involves almost its own set of scientific rules. And the wizards are like scientists or alchemists. And because the magic in this book is inaccessible to most people, it does lend itself well to that period of American history where a very small group of influential men have access to this world-changing power, and they are not willing to share it. And there's also fierce competition among the sorcerers here to gain and hoard knowledge for themselves, and so they are a very fractious group. Caleb states that his purpose is that the cabal of wizards would share their knowledge freely so that they can achieve some sort of grand objectives. But he knows, along with everyone else, that it's never going to happen. So that's why he actually planned on killing the entire cabal. So he's not a good man, but he does sometimes shift into the protagonist role once or twice, as long as it benefits his character. So those are the two most interesting stories to me from the 8. Although I do want to touch on several others before I conclude the episode, because I do find this world to be very interesting. So another feature of this magic is that there are shape-shifting potions in this world. In one of the stories, Caleb, he asked Letitia's sister, Ruby, to act as his spy. And in return, he allows her free access to a potion that will allow her to take on the image of a beautiful white woman. And so this allows for this interesting possibility for Ruby to explore the world from a more privileged position. So she experiments with walking around without being accosted, which I think is a clever thought experiment that's great for speculative fiction. The problem with this, though, is that, as with magic in most stories, there is a cost. So she discovers that the potion is derived from the body of the actual woman whose image she mimics when she consumes the potion. The woman herself is unconscious, and she's kept alive to harvest her blood for the elixir. So obviously that ruins the process for Ruby, and it complicates her relationship with Caleb, because they have this cat and mouse flirty relationship. The next thing to know, it's the least interesting, I think, but ghosts are also real in this universe, and they are able to affect the world. I don't find it terribly original or different from other ghost stories that manifest in haunted houses found in other lore, so there's not too much to say about that. One other piece of lore that I find interesting here is that curses can follow people around. In one of the creepier stories, Atticus's little cousin, his name is Horace, is menaced by several thugs. And these gangsters cast an enchantment on him, and it prevents him from speaking to his family about their plans to capture his mom, Hippolyta, who was the space traveler from the previous story I covered. I'm not sure why this concept seems so familiar to me, but I'm sure that I've seen this in some sort of fantasy movie or story before, where a character knows a villain's plan, but for some reason a magic prevents them from sharing it with anyone. It sounds like, honestly, the ultimate horror story for kids, in my opinion. You know, imagine if you were a child and you have to rely on adults to care for you. So you're in this automatically helpless position, but then you are magically cursed to where you can't tell your parents. It's like a nightmare scenario. And so the curse also has an even creepier feature, and that is that Horace is stalked by this creepy doll throughout the city. It turns out that the doll is one of those exaggerated black dolls from the old days, and it chases him around the city. It's pretty creepy. So the doll and the curse demonstrate well that the rules of magic in Lovecraft Country are very broad. And I would say that they follow Brandon Sanderson's concept of soft magic as opposed to hard magic, because we as the reader are not made aware of the details and the rules of magic in this universe. It works for the narratives, and as always with a soft magic system, I would love to have a small encyclopedia or history of the magic in this universe, or at least more details on the inner workings of the Order of the Ancient Dawn, and so on. Although I read Lovecraft Country before I checked out the HBO show, I did skim through and watch some of the episodes, and I do have some thoughts on that. The first is that since the book is adapted by HBO, we all know that it's going to have sexualized characters in it. I find that that really cheapens the story. Not only in this story, but in other HBO adaptations that are changed for streaming, I find that that is a consistent annoyance to me. And so it kind of set back the story for me. There's also several other changes. Letitia is not portrayed well in the show. She comes across much nerdier to me in the book, and the show really plays up her masculine traits like aggression and cursing. But in the book, she's really wily and seems kind of nerdy and I don't know, sneaky. And that doesn't really come across well in the show. But the music is good and it has pretty decent cinematography. There are some creepy kind of jump scares in the show, but nothing I haven't seen before. But I will say that I'm glad that I read the book first, because the quality of the show would actually not have encouraged me to read the book. Some may say that the current state of streaming shows and the stereotypical problems that are currently plaguing fiction IPs like Rings of Power and Star Wars and others are also present in this show, and I tend to agree. It seems that the narrative is not the first consideration of the writing, and that's probably the best way I know how to articulate how I feel about the Lovecraft Country show. So in conclusion, I believe that Lovecraft Country is a nice departure from traditional fantasy or science fiction, and I think it should be on everyone's radar, especially if you live in America.